In addition to his responsibilities of being pastor of the Elmbrook Church outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he travels all over the world speaking. Hasn't he been inspirational? Welcome with me, Stuart Briscoe. Bring him on.
Thank you, David, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. An old English vicar once distinguished himself by saying, "Before I speak to you, I would like to say a few words." That's what I would like to do. I'd like to thank you very much for inviting Jill and me to share in this conference with you. Jill is already back home. In fact, I talked to her a few moments ago, and she's just finished teaching her class on Thursday morning and is now busy making 3 television broadcasts. And so while I stay here, she's back running the church. It's been a great privilege to be with you. I do apologize for speaking so long the other evening. I totally lost track of the time. I think most of the speakers have mentioned the fact with these spotlights in your eyes you can't see a thing up here, and so I do apologize for going over time, but I have set my alarm for 11:19. I am to stop at 11:20. I will stop at 11:20. That does not mean I will finish. I'll just stop. There's a beautiful little verse in the book of Proverbs which says that words aptly spoken are like apples of gold in settings of silver. I have no idea what an apple of gold in a setting of silver is, but it sounds very beautiful and very valuable. And so I'm assuming that what that verse means is that words aptly spoken can be very beautiful and extremely valuable. And what I want to do with you in this final session today is simply share with you, almost in a sense, some words of testimony. I realize you've had a very active time. You're probably not up for a long, solid biblical exposition. And so this is what I want to do. I want to share with you some of the apt words that people have shared with me that have been life-changing, and I don't think any of them thought they were at the time. I do this for 2 reasons. Number one, because you are all people in positions of saying things that at the time you probably think are not all that significant, and yet the repercussions may be vast. The second reason I want to share it with you is this: that as I took the time to think over the critical things that people have said to me over the years, I realized that almost invariably I had failed to thank them. And so I carefully went about thanking them for the significant role that they had played in my life. And most of them were very surprised to hear about it. And so let me share with you some of the critical things that have happened in my life. I hope there will be some lessons here, but I hope there will be an encouragement for you, first of all, to be careful about what you say to people, and secondly, perhaps an encouragement that you might take with you home the idea of sharing with other people gratitude for what they've done in your life. I was born at a very early age in the north of England, and I was born into a Christian family which gave me a flying start. I don't remember very much either about my birth or the years immediately succeeding. No, I'm serious. I really don't. But on one occasion, I remember something very significant. It was a Sunday morning. My younger brother was ill. It was snowing. I think it was June or July in England. My father was the lay pastor of a very small church. How small was it? It was so small that my brother and I were the Sunday school until we grew up and became the youth group. On this particular occasion, my younger brother was ill, and so my mother had to stay home to look after him, and to my intense delight, I was told that I could stay home too. So I got a little stool and I put it in front of the fireplace that was there to, as we put it euphemistically in England, warm the house. In actual fact, it warmed about a square yard in front of the immediate fireplace. I got the stool as close to the fire as I possibly could and sat on it, the stool, that is, and proceeded to do what you do in England, or did in those days before central heating. I proceeded to fry my front as I froze my back. You stay in that position until both are so excruciating that you cannot stand it a moment longer, and then you turn around in order to fry the frozen and freeze the fried. You're with me so far? This is where the expression "moving in evangelical circles" originated. Then the most remarkable thing happened. I started to think. Would you control yourself, madam? I started to think. And it was rather interesting because I was not reading anything, I was not watching anything, I was not listening to anything, I was just sitting there, and I suddenly thought, I'm not a believer. Right out of the blue, I'm not a believer. I went to the bottom of the stairs and I shouted out to my mother, I am not a believer. She was somewhat startled by this, came running down, grabbed her Bible, turned to the book of Revelation, quoted Revelation chapter 3, verse 20, totally out of context. I had no idea what she was talking about, but she took the trouble to explain it to me, and as best I knew how, I responded to what it said. And having asked her what this door was and what it meant to open it and what the knocking was and how you knew, and all the other things related to the very simple invitation that is contained in that verse, my mother prayed with me, and I opened my life to Christ. Immediate question that came to mind was, how do I know that he's come in? And my mother said, and here's the apple of gold in a setting of silver. She said, these are the words of a gentleman. Now in those days, we had a saying in England that an Englishman's word was his bond. In other words, if he said it, he meant it. Things have changed, of course, since then. But this was the underlying thought. And something was born in my heart that day as a young boy. It was simply this, that if Jesus Christ says it, he means it. And you can put total confidence in his word. And to this day, I have a tremendous confidence in his word. In fact, that has been the fundamental basis of my ministry to this day. I preach and I have utter confidence in the relevance and the intrinsic and innate power of the word. I preach because I believe that the same Spirit who inspired it broods over our gathering to interpret and lives within people's lives to implement it. And it is all born in this simple statement that my mother gave me when I was a small boy. You can trust what Jesus said, for these are the words of a gentleman. Make sure that you instill this in the young people that you're working with, because you see, we are wallowing in a sea of relativism in our culture at the present time. But what people are looking for is some absolute truth. And they need to be shown that that is to be found in who Christ is and in what he said. Moving right along. I proceeded at a more or less normal speed, and when I was 17, I did a remarkable thing. I achieved my lifetime ambition. Most people take a little longer. My lifetime ambition, however, was not very noble, so it was relatively easy to achieve it. Would you like to know what my lifetime ambition was? I was very, very anxious to leave school. And so I did at the age of 17. And I promptly got a job in a bank, and they immediately sent me off to another town to work. When I got to this other town, I found that my parents were a little bit leery about me at the age of 17 going off into the big cold world, and so they had arranged for me to stay with some friends of theirs. In those days, to work in a British bank was regarded as a privilege. They didn't pay you, they just expected you to be grateful for the privilege of working for them. And so I had to stay with friends. They belonged to a church that was, in comparison to the one I'd been brought up in, gargantuan. That meant they had a youth group with about 20 young people in it. It was wonderful. I went there, and this third week I was there, a total stranger came up to me, and he said, "How old are you?" I said, I'm 17. He said, "It's time you were preaching." I said, I can't preach. "Have you ever tried?" "No." "Well, if you've never tried, how do you know you can't do it?" That's a good point. Good point. The Church of Jesus Christ is full of people who are convinced they cannot do what they've never attempted. It is our responsibility to make sure that people are given the opportunity to do things in order that they can discover whether they're gifted or not. The way you find out if you've got a spiritual gift, incidentally, is by trying it. And if you're any good at it, it's because you're gifted. And if you're no good at it, it's because you're not. It's not complicated. I hear people running seminars on spiritual gifts. You don't need to run seminars on it. I mean, it's very helpful to know what the Bible says about it, but it's even more helpful to know something that needs doing and get up and do it. And if you're any good at it, you say, "Oh, what a surprise. I'm gifted." And if you're no good at it, it's only a matter of time until somebody sitting out there will say, "Oh, for goodness sake, let me do it." And you say, "Thank you." It is called the mobilization of the pew. Back to my story. I'm sure you're very anxious to hear what happened. "I can't preach," I said. "Have you ever tried?" "No." "How do you know you can't do what you've never attempted?" I said, "You will preach a week from Tuesday. And your subject is the church at Ephesus," he said. At that juncture, I was not aware they had a church at Ephesus. But I became an avid student of the church at Ephesus. Please notice that the best way to motivate people is to mobilize them. Usually we're told, motivate them, motivate them, motivate them, and then mobilize them. We've got all kinds of ways of motivating people so that they're so worn out by learning all the ways to be motivated that they've no energy left to be mobilized. I'll tell you a quicker way. Mobilize them, and they'll become motivated. There are two ways of teaching people to swim. One is to give them a textbook entitled How to Swim. Another one is to push them in the deep end. The second method usually works much quicker. Two things can happen. One is they sink, the other is they swim. If they sink, you pull them out, dry them out, and say, "You sank." And they will say, "Right," and you've reached a point of commonality from which you can begin to work. If they swim, jump in and perfect their stroke. So the great day came when I was to preach. The church at Ephesus. I took a deep breath, dare not look at the people who were sitting in front of me, awaiting my imminent downfall. And I embarked on my first point. I had three, of course, I'd learned from British preachers. At the end of my first point, I stole a surreptitious glance at the clock, which I knew would not have moved. To my amazement, it had moved with tremendous alacrity. In actual fact, it had gone past my stopping point. I was already 5 minutes over time. I know what I tried to say, but what actually came out was, "I'm terribly sorry, I don't know how to stop." And an old man who was an intruder in the meeting, sitting on the back row, was tremendously helpful. He said, "Shut up and sit down." Apple of gold. No. No, the apple of gold is this. How do you know you cannot do what you've never attempted? That has pushed me to the limits constantly. That has made me move out of comfort zone not infrequently. Because you see, I have a tendency to be lazy. I have a tendency to prefer comfort zone. I have a tendency simply to sit on the status quo. And my experience is this: people who sit on the status quo usually find the status is extremely quo. And that is not the way of progress. How do you know you can't do what you've never attempted? it was rather interesting. The man came up to me and said, "You went over time." I said, "Yes." He said, "You didn't finish either." I said, "That's right." He said, "You'll finish it next week." So it developed into a series. At the end of the series, which had two messages in it, he then said, "There are a lot of little churches around here don't have pastors. So I'm going to arrange for you to take their Sunday afternoon services. You'll get on your bicycle and you tour around the area and you just go and preach." I said, "What do I say?" He said, "Tell them about the church at Ephesus." So the whole area became deeply taught on the subject of the church at Ephesus. I found out incidentally why they didn't have pastors. They didn't have congregations. But it was a wonderful place to start preaching. You see, a lot of people want to start at the top, but the only people who start at the top are those who dig holes. I started my banking career, and I started my preaching career in my spare time. I took a 2-year hiatus to help. There was a war in Korea at the time, and they sent a very nice letter and asked me if I'd help them with it. And I began to be very much concerned about the young people who never darkened the door of a church. In those days, the young people, I'm talking about the 60s now, the late 50s and the 60s, the young people were congregating in coffee houses. The reason they congregated in coffee houses was that they were only interested in 3 things. They were interested in drinking coffee, they were interested in listening to their music, and they were interested in growing their hair. A coffee bar proved an ideal place in which they could do all 3 at the same time. For as they held their coffee cups in their hands and responded to the music, the coffee splashed, producing a warm, damp atmosphere in which their hair grew. Many of them had flowers behind their ears, which many people did not know were also growing. A lot of people in the church were very critical of those kids, and one day I did ask a rather rude question. I asked some of the critical people in the church, "How many of these kids do you know?" And I discovered that none of them knew any of them. I didn't either. I was busy fishing in bathtubs. I was trying to convince the convinced. I was preaching to the choir most of the time. And to be quite frank, I was less than enthusiastic about risking going out among these kids. But one night I felt compelled to go into a nearby coffee bar called the Cat's Whisker. I went into the Cat's Whisker. It was dark, it was dingy, it was noisy, it was crowded. I almost tripped over a couple. I apologized, and they looked at me rather oddly, because I did look rather odd in that situation. And I thought I ought to say something, and so I said the first thing that came into my head. Well, I think I probably said it before it came into my head, because if I'd realized it was in my head, I would not have said it. But what I said to him was, "Oh, excuse me, are you alive?" And I was as surprised as he was. And he said, "What?" I said, "Are you alive?" He turned to his girlfriend, he called her his chick. He said, "He wants to know if I'm alive." And she said, "Well, are you?" He said, "Yes, I'm alive." So I said, "Why are you alive?" He said, "Why does there have to be a why?" Well, I said, "Can you see anything in this room that doesn't have a purpose? That stool, no. That table, no. That light, no. That door, no. That coffee cup, no. That guitar, no. Those blue jeans, no. That t-shirt, no. Can you see anything in this room that doesn't have a purpose? No. Are you greater or lesser than all these things I just mentioned? Greater. If you're greater than all these things that have a purpose, is it not reasonable to assume that you being greater have a purpose?" He said, "Yeah, it's reasonable." I said, "Well, what is it then?" He said, I have no idea." I said, "Would you like to think about it?" He said, "Yes, I would." So he was quiet for a moment, then he smiled. He said, "I know why I'm alive." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I was born and haven't died." So I said, you're right. Let me ask you a question, I said. Did you have anything to do with your birth? He said, no. Do you plan to have anything to do with your death? He said, no. I said, as far as you're concerned then, you were initiated by something that is purely accidental, and you will be terminated by something that is purely accidental. He said, that's right. And then he looked at me, and suddenly, deadly serious, he said, you're right. I had nothing to do with my birth. It was an accident as far as I'm concerned. I'll have nothing to do with my death. It was an accident as far as I'm concerned. I am simply an accident suspended between accidents. Think of that. Do you know what I discovered? This guy was the weirdest looking character you ever saw. You wouldn't have thought he had two brains to rub against each other. In actual fact, he was incredibly bright. You would not have thought for a moment that he had the slightest interest in spiritual things. In actual fact, there was phenomenal spiritual interest there. It was very interesting. We pursued our conversation for quite a long time. And then he said something to me that was really quite compelling. He said, you know, I don't think you believe anything that you've been telling us. I said, I beg pardon? He said, I don't think you believe anything you've been telling us. I said, why'd you say that? By this time, all the kids in the coffee house had gathered round. They were all listening with rapt attention to our conversation. He said, because what you have told me this evening about God and God creating us and there being a purpose and us messing it up and him sending his son to redeem us and to put things right and to roll back the consequences of the fall. He said, all this that you've been telling us and the possibility of him getting hold of our lives and steering us in a pattern that is planned out for us, and the possibility of us living a life of significance and dying without fear and living with him for eternity. He said, all this that you've told us, it is so wonderful that if you really believed it, you'd have been down here long before tonight to tell us kids. I don't think you believe a word of it. And with that he got up and walked out. And I've never been quite the same since. Apple of gold. If you really believed what you say you believe, you'd been down here long before tonight to tell us. Interesting, isn't it? Interesting what people can say to you. They've no idea the impact that it's going to have on your life. When I got this letter about helping them with the war in Korea, I wrote back and said I'd be very happy to help. And so they insisted that I had a medical examination, which I had, and they poked me and prodded me and did all kinds of unmentionable things to me, and then said, and I quote, "You are a magnificent specimen." They did not say of what, unfortunately. They said then, what would you like to join? And I said, quite frankly, I don't particularly want to join anything, but what do you suggest? And they had a man standing there in a magnificent uniform. And I thought to myself, I like that uniform, and I rather like the idea of me being in that uniform. So I said, what's he? And they said, oh, he's a Royal Marine, and that is an elite corps, and that is just for volunteers. So I said, well, can I volunteer for the Marines? They said, if you want to volunteer. I said, okay, I just volunteered. And so that's how stupid you can be. So I went back home, and I remember telling my parents, they wanted to know, my parents wanted to know how things were, and they said I was a magnificent specimen. And they said, well, what's going to happen? I said, well, I've joined the Marines. And my mother said, the what? The what? When she got excited, she used to repeat questions. So I said, the Marines, the Marines. And she said, what are they? I said, I really don't know, but you start as a submarine and work up to an ultramarine. And I thought that was extremely witty, and she did not think it was funny at all. We did, however, have a very good friend who was a captain in the Royal Artillery. His name was Captain Horace Sidney May, a career officer. When he heard that I was going into the armed services, he was delighted. And he said to me, you will, of course, nail your colors to the mast, apple of gold in a setting of silver. You will, of course, nail your colors to the mast. Well, that seemed rather a nautical expression coming from an army man, an artillery officer, but I knew what he meant. I'm not sure if it's an expression with which you're familiar in the North American continent, but in the old days, when the ships of the Royal Navy would go out to sea, they would hoist up to the masthead the colors of the sovereign. If they got into trouble and had to surrender, they would hoist down the colors of the sovereign and put up the white flag. But sometimes when they sailed out into battle, someone would shin up the masthead after the sovereign's colors with a hammer and nails and hammer the colors to the mast so that there'd be no surrender. You will, of course, nail your colors to the mast. I said, how do I do that, Captain May? He said, the first night you're in your barrack room, you will kneel by your bed and pray. I said, well, what will happen? He said, well, I did that when I joined the Royal Artillery, and they threw boots at me. So I said, what did you do? He said, I cleaned them and I returned them. Well, I was not too enthusiastic about nailing my colors to the mast or cleaning their boots. I remember going into that barrack room in the Royal Marines the first night, looking around and thinking I'd never seen such a bunch of cutthroats in my life. I wasn't sure which I dreaded more, facing their boots or facing Captain May and telling him I hadn't done it. I compromised. I waited till they were all up the other end of the room, and then I knelt by the bed trying to look as if I was searching for something underneath. I realized that they'd seen me. Total silence enveloped the room. Then I heard the squeaking of floorboards, and I realized they were all walking down towards me. I couldn't think of a thing to pray. I thought, I'll stay here for the rest of my life. And I thought, I can't do that. So I counted up to 25 and got up. Wasn't sure what to expect. They were all sitting around looking at me with blank amazement. And one of them said, what was he doing? Another one said he was praying. Who to? God. Under the bed? One of them then said, consider the lilies, they toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you that Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like unto one of these. Someone said, what's that? He said, I don't know. He said, I learned it when I used to go to church when I was a kid. He was the sum total of biblical knowledge in that barrack room of 30 Marines. Credible. And I'd done something with great temerity. I'd nailed my colors to the mast. And you may be interested to know this, that within 2 weeks, every one of those men had accepted a Bible, and before we went to bed at night, we used to pray together. It's amazing. It's amazing what effect people's words can have on you. These are the words of a gentleman. You never know what you can do if you haven't tried. Nail your colors to the mast. If you really believe these things, you'd have been down here long before tonight to tell us. My banking career and my preaching career went along in tandem, till in the end it was perfectly obvious that I couldn't do both. And so my wife and I prayed, and we said, God, if you want me to quit the preaching and concentrate on the banking, that's fine. Or if you want me to quit the banking and concentrate on the preaching, that's fine. But if you want us to do the latter, open the door of ministry. Within a week, 2 organizations approached us and asked us if we would leave the bank and go and minister with them. But then the same weekend, the bank offered me the promotion I'd worked for 13 years to get, a plum job. I won't bore you with the story, but I was very, very tempted, having already committed myself to go into ministry if the door opened. I was very tempted to back off on that and take the plum opportunity that would have led me to a position of tremendous banking responsibility in the European common market. Fortunately, I had my little New Testament with me a few moments before I was to go into the interview with the general managers of the bank, and I opened it where it had been closed from the morning reading, and words leapt off the page. Lift up your eyes and look on the fields, they're white, or ready to harvest. So I closed it shut, and I went in, and the 3 general managers said to me, well, Mr. Briscoe, tell us, what are your ambitions? And I said, to preach Christ. And I have never seen 3 jaws drop further quicker. Apple of gold in a setting of silver. Lift up your eyes and look on the fields. They're white or ready to harvest. I have time for one more. I used to work with Major Ian Thomas. Many of you know him. I've known him since I was 17 years of age. I went to work with him at Cape and Ray. That's where we had our camping, our conference center experience for many years. On one occasion he came to me and he said, January, February and March of next year, I've arranged for you to go to the United States of America. I've just done a 13-week preaching tour there. They asked me to return to all the places. I wasn't able to go, but on my recommendation they've accepted you. Your first week you'll minister with Alan Redpath, the second week with Stephen Alford, the third week with Paul Rees, and he went down a long list. I said, whoa, hold it. Just a minute. I said, I don't know America. I don't know Americans. I'm very young. I wouldn't know how to do this. You put me in a culture I don't understand, and you team me up with all the who's of preaching. As far as I was concerned in those days, I can't do it. I just can't do it. And he, in typical fashion, very British, very military, gave me a little apple of gold in a setting of silver. He simply said, Jesus Christ in you is adequate. Get on with it.
May be seated.